Good morning and good evening to the audience and our speakers for the 10th Transatlantic AI Exchange web session. Today's April 7th, 2022. I'm Thomas Neubert, born and raised in Germany, a longtime entrepreneur living in Silicon Valley for over 30 years now, and now working at Intel's headquarters in Santa Clara around the topics related to artificial intelligence and the data center of the future. We are, again, super excited bringing together experts and connecting them with the up-and-coming German and European AI ecosystem. Allow me for a moment to provide a quick overview of this Transatlantic AI Exchange initiative. The Transatlantic AI Initiative is a platform that aims at accelerating and expanding the transatlantic knowledge exchange in the human-to-machine economy, the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution. We foster exchanges on AI and create the grounds for entrepreneurs and researchers and investors, the German Mittelstand, which is the SMBs, and policymakers to build long-term partnerships. Within less than a year, we have been able to build an incredible network of experienced people, creating 9 virtual sessions, today's the 10th, to share useful and valuable knowledge to over 2,100 attendees. We also hosted the first virtual European AI conference on March 22nd, which alone had over 1,100 attendees from a record-breaking 84 different countries. We could not do this without our sponsors. Therefore, I would like to thank our platinum sponsor, Taylor Wessing, our gold sponsor, the German consulate in San Francisco, and our new partner, the Startup Network Europe out of the UK. We have already secured an impressive list of upcoming events and are excited about the topics and the experts supporting our program. If you believe our event is of value to you and your network, we greatly appreciate to share and like us on our LinkedIn page. Now, this is new. We are excited to also announce our 2022 awards program to support entrepreneurs in their journey. So any person who attended at least 2 of our 2022 events, has shared the event, and is following us on LinkedIn can win up to $1,000 towards a travel expense to either Silicon Valley, which is where I am and some other friends of mine, or Hamburg, and get up to 6 hours of coaching and mentoring from our transatlantic AI experts. So that's probably, hopefully, worth pursuing this. If anyone has transatlantic AI or AI-related topics of any sort, please reach out to us, and we will consider building them into our program. We are excited to announce yet another experienced panels of experts to discuss challenges create opportunities, how the US and Europe can obtain autonomy and sovereignty in a new digital world. So let's get to it. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Alexander. Maybe a few words about yourself, please, and Alexander. With that, I would like to hand it over to you. Enjoy.
Hey, hello everyone. Thank you, Thomas, for the perfect introduction, to this session. My name is Alexander Stojanovic. I'm what people usually refer to as a serial entrepreneur, like a repeating entrepreneur. Throughout my career, built 3 companies that got acquired by corporations, and all of them worked in the field of digital media and technology. Today, I'm one of the co-founders of AVA. Some refer to us as a kind of weather forecast, yet not for wind, rain, and sun, but for crime, terrorism, natural disasters, all type of risks. And another way, to frame what we do is when people say we are almost like the Bloomberg terminal, yet not for financial market intelligence, but really for risk intelligence, where we support large cities, police forces, but also corporations to really keep all of the risk environment in their perspective. I really care about these topics, and not only from the perspective of an entrepreneur and a businessman, advisor, and investor, but really I'm fascinated and interested in the geopolitical implications like of this type of technology. I truly believe that we are living in times where we have the opportunity to shape how our future will look like. We are not victims, so to say, like of the decisions that someone made in the past, but we are really in a time where we as humans can influence like how our future will look like, much more than probably all of us would have had the chance to if we were living like 100 or 200 years ago. And that's why I really care about like also topics like we are having today, which is the question of particularly how US and Europe can obtain both individually or in partnership autonomy and sovereignty in this new digital world that we're looking at. And a bit like the key question here is like, what type of challenges do we have and what type of opportunities arise from these challenges? And in order like to discuss this topic like with humans that really understand this matter from different perspectives, I'm happy that we have been able to win over like these personalities that I would want to introduce to you, or that who will introduce themselves each one by one. We will start like with Anastasia Lauterbach. Please introduce yourself just quickly.
Hi guys, Anastasia. I am actually currently in Salzburg in Austria in Europe. I do three things in life. I sit on corporate boards in the UK, US, in continental Europe. I teach artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and business ethics at a university. And I run EMEA for an organization called the EXCO Leadership Group. And we are a firm of former CEOs and CXOs, and we mentor companies in Fortune 2000, in private equity, and nonprofits.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Also, we have joining today Beatriz Botero. Beatriz, please introduce yourself as well.
Alexander, and such a pleasure to be here. So my name is Beatriz Botero Arcila. I'm connecting myself from Paris, where I am a professor of law at Sciences Po Law School. And I am also a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, and co-founder and head of research at the Einstein Institute. We're a pop-up institution, which means we'll only be around for a few years. And we're doing a lot of groundwork in different cities around the world to explore how surveillance is really changing social dynamics, what we call the urban social contract, and whether and how we should address that changing situation in different places around the world.
Awesome. Knowing you and knowing the Edgens Institute, I'm also like one of the fans and supporting the organization. I'm really happy that also you took the time today to join, because I believe like your perspective will add a very important and also interesting flavor like to the complete conversation. Also, I'm really happy, almost proud like that we have had the chance like to win Courtney Bowman from Palantir to join us today as well. Courtney, please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Alexander. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here and to share the virtual stage with such a distinguished group. I am the Global Director of Privacy and Civil Liberties Engineering at Palantir Technologies. I've been at the company for about the last 11.5 years. All of that time in the capacity of running this interesting multidisciplinary team that's focused on challenging issues at the intersection of privacy, law, policy, technology, ethics, and philosophy. And so my work is concentrated on helping the institutions that Palantir works with and the communities and stakeholders at large to understand things like the limits and capabilities of technology applied in specific contexts, how data can be used to augment and enrich different workflows and capabilities, and ensuring the effective use of the software platform systems that Palantir Technologies builds for our customers in the commercial and in the public sector.
So now here I am. I just unmute myself like while you're speaking. So it took me a second now to click the button. The fourth person in this room, I also know for a while now, and I'm very, very happy that he also was willing and to join like this panel. Tyson, who I know from the Aspen Institute in Germany, and unfortunately has moved on. So we are not having that much of relationship on a day-to-day basis or like on a week-by-week basis as we had before. The more like I'm really happy to have him here, like joining us with his broad knowledge on the topic. Tyson, please introduce yourself.
Sure. Well, thanks so much, Alex. And by my name and my accent, you probably can recognize that I'm an American, but I am based in Germany. And kind of a compliment to what Alex said, I consider myself somewhat of a serial policy entrepreneur, and that might scare some of the people in the room, but I have been at the German Council on Foreign Relations now for 2 years, where I founded the program on technology and global affairs at DGAP, as it's known here in Berlin. Prior to that, I was at the Aspen Institute Germany, where I founded the digital program, where I worked with Alex. And before that, I was in the State Department in the Obama administration as a political appointee working on Europe at the time, and was actually hired to do trade and technology issues, but the position and the world events got in the way, and I got pulled into Russia and Ukraine in 2014 and 2015. So we have a little bit of history repeating itself. Digital issues, transatlantic trade and technology issues still remain extremely important. Data flows, post-privacy shield, AI governance, all these kind of questions. But of course, they're inflected by the geopolitical landscape in which they are developing. And of course, we are again in the midst of a conflict in Ukraine.
It's kind of interesting. I think we will touch on that aspect also, like in a couple of minutes, but like how things intersect. I mean, like the complete developments that we have seen only recently, like in Russia and the Ukraine, seem to just be like also like one additional layer of the decoupling of the world, right? Like a kind of deglobalization. So when before we had like the idea of creating like really this globalized playing field, like for everyone, now it's becoming more and more important, like to think about aspects like sovereignty and how technology is also shifting like power dynamics across the board. And interestingly, prior like to really getting like the conversation started, it's interesting, like from my perspective, I believe AI has or data in general and technology has changed like the complete thinking. I mean, only recently there's a TechCrunch. Usually when you go to TechCrunch, which is a website like for, let's say, startup entrepreneurs, right? Like and venture capital investors, usually what you will see there are articles on some, like companies receiving funding and stuff like that. They have started like to write articles on geopolitics, right? Like, look at that, right? Like it arrived like in the field, like where usually you would think of, fail forward, push things forward, like don't think too much about it, just move fast and break things. And all of a sudden we are discussing geopolitics on TechCrunch. And just to quote some aspects around it, they in this really interesting article, they believe that the developments in AI will shift the power balance between nations, right? Like I think this is clear. There is definitely some truth to it that we can already see. It's the space that everybody really seems to be discussing. And I remember like a quote, like also from Gabe Carl, which is like a hedge fund working particularly in Asia, when they said that Taiwan is the Alsace-Lorraine of our age. Particularly with focusing on semiconductors and AI, right? Like, so what in the past has been France, and the intersection between Germany and France is now like this space. So, technology plays a role in this. The second one that they refer to is that AI will probably also empower a new set of geopolitical players beyond nation states. And what they mean with that is that, when Elon Musk, like a couple of days ago, declares to take a large scale in Twitter, a large stake in Twitter, then this is not just business news. This is political news, right? Like the accumulation of power in the hands of private organizations, of businesses, and to some extent also of individuals has reached a level that we probably have not seen before, and with AI that might even continue to rise. And then, of course, we will have new forms of conflict, both in the digital domain as well as in the physical domain, driven by AI. So just to reference like to this article, which I really find interesting, please look it up on Google for everyone who's interested. I would like really to kick off this panel and ask this, I'd say, like really interesting question, where like US and China, particularly in the past years, played the technology and AI card as some part of their geopolitical strategy. Examples, I think, some of them are less known, like the Highlands Forum, which was a Pentagon initiative that eventually, through through some structures, led to the research that was based that based the start like of Google for Sergey Brin and Larry Page, but also In-Q-Tel, a venture capital firm that most people in Europe or in Germany are not aware about, which is like the investment arm of the Central Intelligence Agency, investing famously in companies like D-Wave or Keyhole, which later turned into Google Earth, or even Palantir. And the Chinese as well, like they drive like this complete thing, like really with a lot of like economic and political power. So it's plain to see that these leading powers are seeing that there's more at stake than just revenue and profits. In the light of the accelerating deglobalization that we have now, the question is whether Europe is really naive to believe that it could become a force like in AI and data. And the question is, shall Europe really embrace its role as a junior partner in this transatlantic partnership, like together with the US, or find like its own way? And I would like to kick off the conversation by asking you, Tyson, what do you think?
Well, I appreciate the question, and I appreciate the framing, because I think it's one that you hear a lot. Unfortunately, I don't think that either one of them works. The third way kind of narrative is very limiting for Europe in many ways. For one, there is a sense, let me start with the good news story on AI. If you look at the statistics about the percentage of global researchers in Europe, because I think we are talking about Europe right now, everybody knows that the US is a leader in artificial intelligence research and commercialization and at adoption. Europe has 18% of global researchers and produces about 15,000 global research papers, which is essentially on par with the United States and China. Europe has roughly the same amount of contributions to GitHub that the United States and China provides. Where things start to fray is in the commercialization of that basic research. And I think that is something that policy is trying to address, and it's definitely something that translates into a self-perception that exists in Europe. So, for example, we at DGAP, we did a stakeholder survey last year, which I'm going to pull up. This is, of course, prior to everything that's happening right now, but we asked about certain key enabling technologies: artificial intelligence, mobile network equipment, cloud, quantum, and semiconductors. And we said to European stakeholders across a number of fields, where do you think that Europe is leading, or where is it leading, where does it have peer status, and where is it in a risk management position, and where are dependencies preponderant? And the two areas that were most flagged were artificial intelligence, with 79.8% of Europeans saying that they are too dependent on external actors, and 92% saying that they're too dependent on cloud computing, external actors for cloud computing. And I think we know why, because we're talking about a very limited number of hyperscalers that kind of dominate the field also in Europe, and you look at the market share. But thinking about the third way narrative, although it is politically satisfying, it doesn't achieve the kind of digital sovereignty that Europe actually wants to achieve. And when you look at what digital sovereignty means, especially in the German context, a lot of times what you hear from organizations like Acatech is that it should be about freedom to choose. That you should be able to have the best products. You should be able to have access to the best services. It should be about rules-centric digital sovereignty that reinforces things like informational self-determination, but maintains the openness of markets, especially with like-minded rules-based actors. And pursuing a third way would limit that. At the same time, I don't think we can talk about Europe as being a junior partner, because as you just look at the metrics, and in a lot of areas, Europe is a complete peer. It doesn't always translate into the kind of patents, the IP, in commercialized settings, but that is something, for example, that Germany in the new government is trying to address, and honestly, that Europe writ large is trying to address with what is, we're all getting a little more industrial policy these days, influenced by what's happening in East Asia, but by having a more robust industrial policy. And that applies to not only AI, but also obviously areas around hardware and around data. So I think that Europe has a good story to tell, but there's always room for improvement.
Interesting. So like holding up on particularly that point, like what does that actually mean like for the European AI ecosystem? So not just talking about the startups, for example, that are trying to build something and to commercialize, but also to these large corporations that feel threatened, both left and right, from companies that they, like we can talk about Tesla, which is more or less like a AI and computer company disguised as a car company, right? Like, so is there a significant opportunity left, like for Europeans, both startups as well as corporations? Anastasia, I would like to ask you that. What do you think?
So look, I would share two pieces of data and then I'll comment. Totally into this flavor of what money is flowing where. And if we look into 2021, US invested $38 billion into AI companies, Asia 25, so the majority of those investments, of course, on behalf of China, and Europe 8. Obviously, you see that we have a very large gap in between of what is happening in Europe towards what is happening in Asia and the United States. This is one piece of data. Another piece of data, routinely twice a year, I look into the index of the most valuable companies in the world. And I was really surprised when in September of 21, I discovered Tesla on the list of top 10. And that should be really something upsetting for German automotive companies. My take on it is that this is actually great news, because a newcomer can absolutely break into this index. But this is not a question of technology. It's not a question whether we are deploying some deep neural network, and whether scientists are migrating from France to New York and back. It's a question of leadership. And I think this is where Europe sucks. We truly lack great leaders which will just do the thing. And if I look into incumbents and I see that lobbyists and regulators in terms of departments, so these legal functions are larger than the product functions, here you have your answer. So there is a huge potential for Europe. I mean, you and I, we both know Trent McGonaghy, what he's doing with Ocean. I think this is the way to go. But the first question to ask is, do you have your data strategy in place? Don't move to cloud if you don't understand what is your data strategy. Don't move to AI if you don't understand what data you are using for and why and how. So start with that and then move bit by bit. The opportunity is huge, but do it. And this is a question of leadership, not of technology.
Yeah, true. It like often comes down to the question, what has to be done, right? Like you look at the challenge, they're like, okay, what can we do about it? What is the next step to take? One thing that I often came across, and it frames a little bit like also the question of where the opportunity lies, and there's something that I've been told like very often in regards like to my very to compete like with much better capitalized companies in a very competitive space that is very complex. So we often hear that ethics may turn out like to be a decisive competitive factor like for European AI companies. So the question that I often ask myself is, what does that mean effectively? Like, are Europeans really that more ethical than the Americans? Looking at the past 200 years, people could argue maybe not, right? Like there are really more bad things happen in Europe than in the US, but do we really have that better governance? And could EU regulation in that regard really be a kind of silver bullet that we can use like to shoot our way like into the market? And I would like to raise this question like to Courtney, because Palantir as a company is in high demand both in Europe as well as in America. And you're researching and looking very deeply into these fields like also of regulation and ethics. Is this EU approach useful? Does it make sense? Is it really a competitive factor? Is it without alternatives? And maybe the most important question, is it really that superior? What do you think?
I think this perception that you refer to of Europe operating is in a more ethical manner with capacity to treat ethics as a competitive factor really does follow from a comment that Anastasia made a moment ago, the idea that Americans just do the thing, whereas Europeans are encumbered by all of their moral hand-wringing. I think that's very much a caricature. And the idea, yes, we see these bold Silicon Valley titans with their monumental ideas pushing industry forward in certain aspects, but the idea that ethics can be held as a monopoly in any jurisdiction, I think is preposterous. Really, what this comes down to is the ability to take ethical considerations, marry them with technology, and innovate in an atmosphere where you're optimizing both against the objectives that you're trying to build upon, but also the fact that you care about the world that you're trying to impact through your technology. And there's a way to innovate ethically and responsibly, and that's a practice that's very much built into our way of operating as a company that works across many different sectors. But I think this gets into the question of can European regulation serve as a silver bullet to how we deal with ethical concerns in the application of artificial intelligence? And I think the challenge there is that we're trying to balance an approach to a very broad class of technologies, technologies that have been in various permutations around for the last 75 years or so, and come up with a way of regulating across all different measures and types of applications of these technologies. And that's a very difficult and tall order. But it's very much a European vein of doing things. Try to come up with a sort of pan technological approach to regulating, as opposed to dealing with the alternative, which might be a more sectoral approach, where you look at the specific instances of AI and specific applications and try and build rule sets that help govern in those contexts. I think there's probably a way in between, and I think that way in between speaks to the fact that Europeans and Americans have much more that unite us than separates us culturally, and I think that's especially important at this moment in history. And the way in between is something like developing a set of broad principles that we all agree that we care about, that enshrine values that are central to Western liberal democratic institutions. And then try and figure out ways to translate that into the practical dimensions and the practical use cases of not just artificial intelligence, but other classes of advanced technologies. And I think this really comes down to a question of imagination. How do we think about not just the state of AI right now, but what it's going to be like 10 years from now? And can we regulate, can we create a piece of regulation that's going to endure? Or do we need to think about regulation as an evolving landscape that's built on a solid set of principles?
It's interesting. It's a little bit like also one could say like a switch that you're proposing that we have seen after all of these like problematic fallouts of companies with governance, where the idea of moving like from a strict rule book, so to say, catalogs of how to behave in the past, and now moving more over like to a principled approach where you don't write down every single rule, but you define like a principle from which the rule as itself like has been derived, so that you can become more adaptive and flexible like to the changes that are ahead. Because if you say 10 years ahead, I mean, like we are in this circle here, we are professionals. I wouldn't dare to say what will be in 10 years. And I would love to hear like if somebody raises hands and said like, I will now tell you what is in 10 years. I will listen carefully, but this is really like a complex topic, as you say. Like now, the things that we are defining right now, they will have impact like on for a very long time. So and on that topic, maybe to bring like also like a slightly different perspective also to it, because we have like business perspective, we have policy, you know, like we're kind of simple analysts, you know, thinking about stuff like really from a meta level. And Beatrice, you are one of them as well, but particularly you are with the Excellence Institute also trying to understand how that unwritten social contract functions between citizens and governments in particular. So keeping our zoom on Europe here for a minute, is there from a, let's say, civil perspective, really that one unified perspective in Europe? Or put differently, is the stance of Germany really aligned with that of Italy and even Hungary? If we say like, yeah, we create like one set of principles, does, you know, like the European Union as such, with its complexity, has the unified like perspective on these things? How would you look at that question?
Yeah, that's an amazing question. So actually at the Institute, we work mostly at the city level, and the degree of diversity that we encounter is even between countries, right? So the question, I think, can be broken up a little bit more, and it's not even between Germany and France and Italy and Hungary, but also life is very different if you are in Berlin or, I don't know, in a small country somewhere in Bayern, in a small city, sorry. So I think,
Regensburg, yeah, exactly.
yeah, in Regensburg or something like that. So I think the actual rules and transformation that we're perceiving is very different. And going back to the geopolitical conversation with which you started, I think one of the interesting things to watch in Europe right now is where is sovereignty being located. So there can be something going on in Brussels, for example, that is a bit of a power struggle that I've been interestingly following, more from the French side, which is where I'm based. But it's interesting that the conversation on digital sovereignty is often spoken about at the European level. That is a big geopolitical transformation. And I think there are also instances in which national governments are pushing back, right? So you see that also in many of the policy conversations in which countries are a little bit more worried about AI regulation that somewhat touches their national security policies. So all of that, I think it's interesting to see because there are indeed, I think, different interests and different preferences, cultural, political, between different countries in the EU. But I guess also back to Courtney's point, it might be the case that the current political moment and what's happening in Ukraine leads to a unified approach. It might be that there's something that in this particular moment of crisis actually pushes to a united response, and that would be an interesting outcome to watch. We're talking about 10 years ahead. This might be like a state building moment for Europe, really. Like for those of you who are in academia, like one of the big state building theories is about how war builds the state. And maybe that's something that is very intertwined with the geopolitical conversation, but also the development of tech and technology regulation. But I think if we think about actual people, and this is different than the conversation that we have maybe as experts or in government, that is a little bit harder to think about. I feel the European audience, especially so in Germany, is very sensible, yeah, to the conversation on privacy. So privacy is a big thing, and I think the data governance questions are close to many European citizens, even so more than in many other places. But one of the interesting things when we talk about AI in government, for many of its good users, is how it changes decision making and how it changes the allocation of resources and services in many spheres of life. with lots of potential for good things and certain risks that are also what we talk about when we talk about AI ethics. And I think that is something of which the general public everywhere in the world, I think, is less aware of the transformation of government, the transformation of power, how this involves them, how it touches them. I think that's something that even in a very educated public, like public in Europe that is acute and aware of privacy, that how that is changing how we think and how we govern. I think that's something that isn't out there, and that it's very close to our mission, you know that. And for those of you who are interested, is how we bring this conversation to the public so that that is transformation is carried out in a democratic and inclusive way.
Interesting. Asking you, Tyson, building up on this answer from Beatrice, the pressure lines, both between inner European players like countries, even like individual policy makers, so to say, as well as within and in the US, and also between US and America. How would you describe the current state of mind, like the current situation? So maybe even in pointing out like this idea of how do you call it, nation building, like Europe's state defining moment. Is there something that you, Tyson, being very present like in these various circles, discussing topics around regulation, policy, and at the intersection of technology and geopolitics, is this something that you also perceive these days getting stronger? How would you describe like the current state like of affairs, so to say?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I would say is it sounds like Beatrice and I have a lot of similar conversations around what is digital sovereignty, and it's kind of a talismanic term that you have to interpret in different ways. But there's, I would say, a kind of, at least my experience here in Berlin and working with Berlin, Brussels, and Paris primarily, is a kind of one central tension is between a kind of ordoliberal definition of digital sovereignty, which is much more centered on rules. It's about open economies. It's about breaking lock-in effects. It's about avoiding path dependencies. It's about informational self-determination. It defines sovereignty, as I think Beatrice was also mentioning, at different levels, including individual sovereignty. So there's, what is the sovereign unit? It can be an individual, it could be a firm, it could be a country, it could be a region. So that's one definition. And it's definitely present in Germany and other places. And another, and I would say, if you look at Brussels, it's kind of the Vestagerian idea of digital sovereignty. You know, Margarete Vestager very much represents that kind of view. Also breaking up, market dominance of online platforms, for example. So any proponent, a suspicion of cartelization, also a very, very strong element in that form of digital sovereignty. And then there's another form of digital sovereignty, which is easier to define because it's essentially technological import substitution industrialization. Or you could call it Gaullism. You know, the idea, it's not rule-centric, it's player-centric. So not necessarily we need to have European rules that are global and evangelized. We need to have European actors that are global and also dominate in the European space. And that is, it's a tension and it's a cohabitation, and you see it in practical debates and everything from important, the current discussion around the European Chips Act and important projects of common European interest around semiconductors, to all the debates around Gaia X and the kind of tensions between the Germans and the French.
Everybody loves that, yeah.
The Commission. But when you talk about regulation more broadly, which is of course still the instrument of choice, especially in Brussels, because it's I'm an American. I know hammer and nail syndrome when I see it. We have we tend to see everything through the lens of national security. Brussels sees everything through the lens of regulation. Not to be too reductionist, but that's kind of the case. You do see an evolution of the way that Brussels perceives technological development, and it is impacting the philosophies driving regulation in two ways. One, on platform governance. So we've got two big bills coming, and we got a ton of big bills coming up, but we got two really big ones on platform governance, the Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act. And they are very much a product of a kind of 2015 worldview. It's very Atlanticist. It looks to the United States and says, what are the correctives that we need to implement here? And if you look at the AI Act, it is a lot more global. And there are certain instances where it looks at China and says, these are things that we actually don't want to have happen here.
Mm.
Be it on social scoring and the use of social scoring by governments, or be it on the use of real-time or remote biometric identification. Although there are other questions, there are tons of questions on. There's still the risk-based, scale is still based on private sector actors, etc. But still, it's much more inflected by the experience from China. So. That process is evolving. The other thing that I think is important to mention here on the reg side, and maybe the standard sides, is the US and Europe are converging. And that's happening in a number of areas. We see that on data protection and privacy, where we have a number of data protection laws at the state level now in the United States. A much more, it's not quite there, but growing federal discourse on privacy rights in the US. You see this on taxation, which we've seen in the OECD. You see this on content moderation. And I was just talking to the White House today about disinformation, content moderation, hate speech, etc., in the context of the Trade and Technology Council. And you see this, of course, we'll see where it ends up, on competition questions and antitrust. Mm-hmm. So in a number of areas, we're seeing greater convergence, and also with AI, because the United States is much more comfortable with a risk-based approach. Now, if I look at what the NIST is publishing on bias, and I read some of the recommendations, I'm like, wow, this sounds really pragmatic. This does not sound like it was produced in Europe. It's a very different approach, but we're still seeing convergence. So
interesting.
I think we're getting there, but it's asymptotic.
Interesting, like convergence. I was like recently thinking, when I was like browsing like through my daily dose of news and headlines and on tech. I was stopping for a second and say, like, wait a minute, like in the past months, I see more and more things coming up that relate like to the regulation and antitrust on big tech in the US. And I was like, oh, this smells very European. This doesn't really sound like American. Interesting, like also in this case. But one thing that I found really interesting when you talked about, I said like play in rules-based and players-based, right? Like I said, like, wait a minute, players, that is an interesting aspect. Do we need capable players in Europe? Yes, probably we need so that we can join the conversation really on eye level. But right now, one could argue there is an absence of capable player in Europe, right? Like, so we have great industrial companies, but they are, like not really part like of defining the future. So right now, Europe's major hope seemed to be all about becoming the referee, not a player itself, like regulating, taxing, like those kind of things. But let's just be ambitious for that one moment and ask that question. I would want to raise it to Anastasia. I know, like business driven, right? Like, and you support a lot of like ambitious CEOs to not only understand the matter, but also take the courage, like to take things in their hands. What would it take for a real powerful European player in the AI and data space to emerge? And what is missing, in order to complete that recipe? Is it more ambitious investors, strategic support from politicians, as we discussed, maybe even less regulation, like something that is a little bit more lightweight, more principle-based? What would you, like if you have to pick like a handful of things that you would implement right away, like to give birth to a European leader, what would it be?
Look, Alex, I am back to my love for leadership because you can operate in whatever governance regime, and you can take European regulations and still be successful. This is not the thing of regulation. It's not the thing of technology. It's the thing of focus. And I love companies which are answering something which is very concrete. And I'll be giving you 3 examples on what might have happened in Europe and still is not happening. So for example, we know, take Switzerland, we know that by the year 2035, 50% of the energy consumption in the country will be on half of data centers. So this is just, a given. So it means that the country needs something to happen in terms of energy. So there are some attempts to build a data trust around energy data, and then you can, of course, innovate around this data, do stuff around this data. This is something concrete. Take the very simple business problem and try to solve it or optimize it with help of technology. One example. Another example, we've got a bunch of traditional automotive companies in Europe. So not just Germany, but we've got Italy, we've got France. So, and the UK, by the way. So I know for a fact that there is a data trust around self-driven miles in Silicon Valley, which is done by traditional automotive companies. And this is because, for example, if you take Waymo, not every mile, which is kind of, driven there, is a truly driven mile. So they've got more synthetic data than they've got true data. And of course, if you have real data, it's always better. So in principle, why don't you pick up a decentralized data market for the self-driven miles? Everyone is making some experiments, and then you innovate on top of this data market. So this might be like a business idea for someone to solve. And this is just, or Innsbruck, so the city I'm going to more or less twice a month, fantastic center of quantum computation, by the way. So they are asking me, I think on a quarterly basis, what should we do in AI? And I'm like, guys, what should you do in your economy? So what type of companies are there? And they're like, oh, wow, we have a number of hospitals which are very famous in surgery for knees and for shoulders for a very simple reason. They've got winter sports, and then they've got a lot of accidents. And they're good, guys, then take those data. You don't need to tell them it's Anastasia and Alex shoulder. You can put it on a metadata sphere, and then you innovate. It's a decentralized data market. There are tons of companies which would kill for this data. There is a demand. Take something concrete and innovate. Don't start with the question, what should we be doing in AI? Just think about what is your business problem, and then how can AI or whatever help. If you do AI as a la pour la or for some fear reasons, it will never, raise the same way as some companies in China or in the United States.
Interesting. So it's really about becoming like concrete. But still, like you said, like there's a lot of activism also in companies based out of fear. Some, of course, like based on a vision, they think like, wow, there could be something really cool. But it is really the case, like when we talk about AI and the expected further advances that come like through data and also the advent of quantum computing, there's always like these two poles, right? Like the one pole that we often see is the like, yeah, we can solve everything, right? Like give us the sustainable development goals like from the UN, and on each one of these boxes we will put AI and solve everything. So utopia, Star Trek. And the other side, like you have these people say like, hey, like the AI overlord will come and will, yeah, what do you say, subjugate humankind and turning all of us like into human batteries. So we will be living in the matrix. Maybe we are already living in the matrix, like those kind of ideas. So when discussing like all of these topics as we're doing right now, which is totally interesting because I think this is like defining the frontier, and ethics, regulation, geostrategy, etc. Are we really on the right track in terms like of where this is all heading? So we are regulating a lot, but is what we are trying to regulate realistically to be expected really from AI? Or are we currently just blinded by some sort of super hype where we put everything that has a kind of AI sticker on it into the bucket of it will be a catastrophe or it will be utopia? What would you say? Are we looking at a realistic picture, Courtney?
So I'm happy to tell you, Alexander, I'm pretty certain we're not in the matrix. And I think that both of those extreme representations are dead wrong. And dead wrong for two separate and equally misleading reasons. I think it's neither the case that AI is a panacea, nor is it the case that AI is a pathway to some sort of superintelligence-led dystopia. The reality is that AI is a set of technologies that are embedded in the world and will always be embedded in the world. And that embeddedness in all of the richness of our experiences in the world implies that there's going to be all sorts of complicated fixations, attachments, dependencies, and externalities that are really unavoidable. So Anastasia's point a moment ago around, it was a client comes to you and asks you, they want to do something with AI. That's exactly the wrong starting point for figuring out whether AI is a promising solution for the thing that you want to do. Start with the problem and figure out what's the effective thing that you actually want to do with that. And I fear that a lot of these misperceptions have arisen, and we've been driven along the wrong track in terms of understanding the place of AI in the world, in part because science fiction has confused us. I think also some of our public intellectuals, even philosophers, I'm trained as a philosopher, have led us astray. But also, I think the worst offenders are researchers and technologists, speaking frankly, who present a vision of an AI world that isn't about to come into being and probably never will. But what we can do with artificial intelligence is think about the real embedded operational applications of the technology and how it can help us solve problems that are well defined. And so one of the things that implies is that you take AI from the sort of toy problem settings in research laboratories and think about what it actually means to build competent, operational, reliable technology in the field. And that means doing things like continuous testing and evaluation, maintenance, and looking at good principles of good data science, good statistics, but also ensuring that you have good data to work with as a starting point, and also acknowledging the true costs of building artificial intelligence, which is often built on computing resources that are environmentally intensive, but also human labor required to train models, to curate data that feeds into the model training. And so what I would propose is that it may actually make sense for us to switch our mental model from thinking about AI as intelligence as such and start to resituate it as a tool in the context of its applications. We are much more effective when we think about what it means to apply a tool like a hammer to a specific application. I think we twist ourselves in knots if we start to ask ourselves questions like, how should we regulate hammers? So I think if we think about regulating and dealing with AI in the specific places and use cases, we get much more refined and I think much more useful and effective answers.
Interesting. There's so many things that are coming up like in my mind. I remember like in one conversation we had a dual use conversation, say like, well, everything can be used like for dual use. You can take your car and drive your grandmother to the train station after the visit, but you can also take the same car and drive over your grandmother as a result like of that visit, depending like really on who you are as a person. So like technology is usually also like related like to the people who are using it. But one thing that really also came into my mind and thinking while you were describing like your perspective, it's that I remember reading about a project that happened at the MIT. I would have to look it up, but it's still reflecting in my mind when you were pointing out like the aspect of the sci-fi, right? Like the science fiction, like everything that, like these grand pictures that we see. And I remember that like this group of researchers, they somehow try to relate like today's advances also in AI, also practical advances in AI to narratives and stories that we have been taught in 80s TV shows, right? Like the autonomous car is like Knight Rider, you know, like, and transhumanism is the $6 million man, you know, like, so we were confronted like with these ideas, and they shaped like our idea of what the future could be. And today, usually when we see future ideas of AI, usually they are dystopian. So there was like the call to do something that shapes, so to say, like also other, or frames like the complete topic around it in a much more positive way, because what we tell people about how things could be will probably at some point become that. And with that, I would want to hand over like also like this the microphone once more to Beatriz, because this question of involving people like generally and shaping the conversation really in the broad sense, not just like amongst the super experts, is something that probably needs to happen if we talk about what will happen like in the upcoming 10 years. Those that are watching TV shows right now with crazy dystopian ideas over AI, they will be the leaders of tomorrow, driving these technologies. So what can we generally do like in order to shape like a positive picture of AI in the conversation with humans, not with organizations, business and politicians, but really with humans?
That's an amazing question. So I think our learning so far are very much related to what Courtney was saying. So there's really something about bringing the technology to the ground, and both demystifying it, so speaking about how it works, where it is deployed, and the actual settings in which it's deployed, and stop thinking about it as this sort of hyper intelligence dystopian machine. And I think something that I think that is important is really talking a lot about actually the context. Like that's also something that I really agree, and the context of people and what are their needs, what are their wants, what are the structures in which the technology is being deployed, and what are the impacts that it's having. And once you do that, and also something that we do at the Institute is really curating experts, spaces where experts are no longer only experts, but are really in conversations on equivalent terms with people. You realize that oftentimes, whatever we are calling experts are the people that know the most about the technology, or know the most about the market, or know the most about whatever their expertise is in, but also people really know a lot about their context. And this turns out to be a very fruitful conversation. It's very fruitful for engineers to understand what it is, how is a particular thing impacting their lives, or for policymakers actually to know how a particular policy might or might not be working for the actual entrepreneur, or simply the person that is dealing with a particular device in a city. So I think there's something about creating spaces where those interactions are positively framed, are enabled, are made simple. So one of the interesting things about this conversation, for example, is that we've been talking about AI for an hour and it hasn't been rocket science. And I think it's actually easy to take that conversation to other places, and many of the principles and things that we're talking about aren't really the black boxes that we often hear about. And recognizing that and opening it up in different settings, I think is a way of getting actually the input of individuals and making the conversation richer, and hopefully that way coming up with better rules and principles about how to deal with it in different contexts.
Well, I could write a very, very long list on the conclusions of this hour that we had together. We will move on now, like to the networking session. There's a link was shared, like to all of you. I would like to say thank you, like to the panelists and to all of the team, all the people in the back and in the front that made all of this possible. Well, I mean, like if I would have to point out like two things, then well, one term that comes to my mind is common sense. Right, like we'll let's take a deep breath and be human, particularly maybe together, like joining like our thoughts and forces. And the other thing that I really liked was also like the discussion over, you know, like this state defining moment, right? Like I really feel as if as a parts of the world, even though everything seems to be decoupling, the parts of the world that we feel mostly attached to, and our culture and our ideas on what a good society should be like, are moving closer together. So the transatlantic AI exchange puts it like really on the perfect term. Like we're in it together, right? Like, and we need to find ways on how to shape the future in a way that it really also intersects and correlates like with the ethics and ideas that we have for the future together. So once more, thank you. I hope to see all of you again, like in 2 minutes in our networking session. I know Anastasia will have to leave us. Thank you so much, Anastasia. But for the rest of the panelists, would be great if you can still join us. And thanks to everyone who joined us. Goodbye. See you soon.